Today, we're cracking open a really fascinating sermon from 1982 by Reverend Sun Myung Moon. It lays out this entire worldview, and it all starts with one single, really powerful metaphor. And there it is. That's the core idea right there. According to this sermon, if you can truly understand how a single seed works, then you've got the key to understanding the entire universe and the force that supposedly drives it all, what he calls true love. So, yeah, let's get into this. All right, so to really get a handle on the philosophy here, we have to start exactly where the sermon does, by taking apart this foundational analogy of the seed. Everything else we're going to talk about builds right on top of this model. So the sermon breaks the seed down into three main parts. First, you've got the outer skin. It says this is like love. It's the protective layer holding everything together. Then, inside, you find two halves, which it calls a plus and a minus. This represents a fundamental duality that you see everywhere. And right between them, you have the embryo, the little spark of new life. Okay, but how do these parts actually do anything? Well, the sermon describes this universal law called give and take. It's this dynamic, back-and-forth interaction between the plus and the minus. And it claims this force, this give and take, is literally the engine that kicks the embryo into gear and drives all creation, not just in a plant, but in the entire cosmos. So now, let's see how this whole thing scales up. Because the sermon takes the logic of that tiny seed and applies that exact same blueprint, plus, minus, and love, to absolutely everything in existence. And to explain this, it draws a really interesting parallel. It compares the invisible force of magnetism, with its north and south poles, to what it calls the force of true love pulling between a man and a woman. The text basically argues that, hey, we accept magnetism as a real, provable force here on Earth. Well, true love is an even more powerful, all-encompassing force throughout the entire universe. And this interaction, this give and take, it's not a static thing. It creates this constant motion. The sermon describes the universe as this giant spiral, where the energy of the cosmos is flowing into the tiniest embryo, and at the same time, the life from that embryo is expanding outward. It's this incredible vision of total cosmic interconnection. So you might be thinking, if we're all so interconnected, why do people feel lonely? Well, the sermon has a really unique take on this. It says loneliness isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. It's described as this protective, painful feeling that's literally designed to push us out of isolation, to make us go seek a partner and get ourselves aligned with this universal law of give and take. And that, of course, brings this whole cosmic blueprint right down to the human level. So this next part of the sermon explains how these universal laws are supposed to be applied directly to our relationships and, most critically, to the structure of the family. The absolute core of this idea is something called the four-position foundation. And according to the sermon, this isn't just a nice family model. It's the fundamental unit of a perfect world. Here's how it works. You have God on a vertical axis as the origin. Then you have man and woman, the plus and minus, forming a horizontal relationship. Their union then produces a child, who is seen as the fruit, and that child completes the foundation, basically making God's love a physical reality on earth. The sermon then gets into a comparison of two family philosophies. What it calls the Oriental view is described as being vertical. It's focused on parents living for their children. And the Western view is described as horizontal, focused on spouses living for each other. The text argues that the vertical model is way more stable, like a spinning top on its axis, and that it's much closer to the heavenly standard. Now, the sermon is very explicit about relationships that fall outside of this specific plus-minus model. It directly states that homosexuality violates this universal law of interaction for creation, and it describes it in these exact terms, as a satanic and destructive force. So if this is the ideal, how on earth does anyone actually get there, especially in our imperfect world? Well, the next section tackles that head-on, framing hardship not as some kind of failure, but as a totally essential part of spiritual training. According to the sermon, there's a clear process. Step 1 is you have to endure trials. Step 2 is about achieving balance. And this is based on the belief that if you suffer now, it will lead to prosperity later. It's just natural law. And the ultimate goal, step 3, is to set a record by overcoming all these challenges. Doing that is said to make a person spiritually invincible, immune to any kind of satanic accusation. And this is where the Unification Church explicitly positions itself. This quote frames the church not as a place you go for comfort, but as a training ground. Think of it like a university, where the main subject is true love, and the final exams are these intense, real-world hardships, all leading to this final graduation, this license of true love. Which brings us to our final section. What is the ultimate purpose of all this struggle, all this training? What's the end game? The sermon calls it the harvest. Right, so this is crucial. The harvest is not a metaphor for going to heaven after you die. It's defined as the actual, tangible creation of a perfected world right here on Earth. A world filled with these ideal families who've mastered true love and are now producing what the sermon calls true children. And you can see here just how incredibly important children are in this worldview. They aren't just offspring, they're the physical proof of this whole cosmic principle at work. They are what completes that sacred family structure. They're seen as the living embodiment of their parents' spiritual state, and really the only hope for the future. And this idea just reframes everything. The sermon wraps up by saying that the act of creating a child isn't some personal, private choice. No, it's presented as the most public action a person can take, a cosmic responsibility that you undertake for the sake of the entire universe, for all of mankind, and for God. And that leaves us with this final thought to chew on. This sermon lays out a vision of true love, not as an emotion, but as a fundamental law of physics, something as real as magnetism. So it raises a pretty provocative question. If this law really is universal, what are the implications for a world where so many people, consciously or not, choose to live their lives outside of its very specific path?